Hello all, it's been a little while since I've posted a video, and one of the bigger projects I'm currently working on is waiting for epoxy to cure, so I thought I'd whip up a bottle opener to share that process. Since I'm making this bottle opener just to make it, I decided to experiment with my process a little bit and possibly use the new process for my openers moving forward. More on that later. This bottle opener, like many others I make, is made from Manzanita. Normally when I make a Manzanita bottle opener, I make them from branches that died naturally and if necessary, use epoxy to fill any cracks and help stabilize the wood. This time though, I didn't want to wait on epoxy to cure and didn't have any suitable branches that wouldn't require epoxy, so I'm using the cutoff from another project I'm working on. The first thing to do when working with a randomly sized piece of wood like this is to get it to roughly the right dimensions so that it can safely be turned on the lathe, so that's what you see me doing now. This cut on the miter saw might look painfully slow, but the video is sped up so it's actually even slower. Some cuts I take slow because the wood is very hard, and some cuts I take slow because my hand is too close to the blade and I want to reduce the risk that something goes wrong. In this case, my hand is closer than I'd like, and the wood is very hard. Turns out this piece of wood isn't entirely crack-free either. Fortunately, the crack is small enough that I can use CA glue to fill it. To do that, I squeeze medium viscosity CA glue on the crack, let it seep down into the crack, then come back and do it again. I didn't record it all, but I repeated this process until the glue had pretty much filled the void. Normally with CA glue, you can spritz it with an activator to quickly cure it. However, when it's deep in a crack like this, I'm not confident that the activator will cause it all to cure. Also, using an activator, in my experience, can cause some bubbling, which is less than ideal if it will be visible in the final product, which this will be. So I let this cure the old-fashioned way and came back the next day to work on it. In order to maximize the material available to me on the lathe, I need to find the actual centers of the ends of the wood. To do that, I use calipers to measure both directions of each end and then set the calipers to half of those measurements and use the calipers themselves to mark the wood. This doesn't always give you a perfect point to call it dead center, but all the lines are close enough that if you don't have a perfect point in the center where all the lines cross, there will be a gap in the actual center which you can use as a reference instead. Once I've found the center of each end, I simply drill a small hole into one end so that I can thread the opener onto my screw chuck. You can use two centers on the lathe instead, but I prefer a screw chuck because the centers can slip and require additional tailstock tension. Now I'm on to one of my favorite steps, which is actually turning the opener on the lathe. The first thing I do is obviously mount it to the lathe using the screw chuck I mentioned before. Once it's threaded tightly on the screw chuck, I turn the lathe on a very low speed and bring the tailstock up to support it. The first thing to do on the lathe is to turn the square cubic rectangle thing into a cylinder. Once the piece is nice and cylindrical, I start to rough out the shape that I want. A lot of openers I've seen are just cylindrical with a rounded end. I find that kind of boring, but I also don't want to make a weird shape just to make a weird shape. So I try to go for something that has a shape to it, but is also a little ergonomical. Unfortunately, there's a fine line between making that shape and making Mr. Hanky from South Park. With the shape of the opener complete, there's not a lot left to do on the lathe, but now that I'm down to the final shape, I can see that there's a little void in the crack that I filled. So before moving on to sanding, I refill that crack and let it cure. To cure the CA glue in this crack, I let it sit for about 10 minutes and then spritz it with the activator. I found that doing this on a small patch of CA glue doesn't leave you with a bunch of little bubbles. Once that's cured, there's a bit of CA glue on the surface that needs to be removed, so I very carefully remove that with a chisel. I say very carefully because if I'm too aggressive here, the cured glue can chip out of the crack I just filled, or I could accidentally carve away the wood which I just finished shaping. With the CA glue cleaned up, I make some pencil marks and sand with a lathe running to remove my poor lathe scale marks. I sand this way with the highest grit I can get away with, and in this case that's 180. Once that rough sanding is done, I remove the excess wood from the opener and file off the remaining nub. That being said, I'm really not great at cutting off the excess, it makes me kind of nervous, so I super sped up the video here. It's important to know that the rough sanding you saw me do is not the final sanding. The final sanding I did off the lathe by hand so that I could sand it in the direction of the grain. If you don't do that, you'll be left with severe circular scratches in the wood. They can be minimized by sanding up to 1,000 grit or more on the lathe, but I don't think it's worth all that, especially since that can negatively impact the finish you apply. What I'm doing now is expanding the hole to be deeper and to be a larger diameter to accept the bottle opener hardware. I bought myself a tap to thread the wood, but that isn't completely necessary. If you drill the hole just the right diameter for the wood, you can use the bottle opener hardware itself to cut the threads. It's just much more difficult. You could also drill a very slightly oversized hole and use epoxy to secure the hardware in place. If you've never cut threads before, it's important to back out the tap every few threads to help clear the sawdust. I think there's probably more to cutting perfect threads though, because the first quarter inch or so in my case strips the wood before it starts cutting the threads. I'm guessing it's the diameter of the hole I drilled that's the problem, but I'm not really sure. So if you know what I'm doing wrong here, please share it in the comments. Typically, I don't do any preparation for the hardware other than getting my girlfriend to help me choose the right color hardware for the wood, since the hardware I purchase comes in packs with various colors. I'll leave a link to the hardware I buy in the description of the video. This time though, I wanted to experiment with powder coating. I recently started powder coating the small hardware from my hook and ring toss games and love the results, so I thought I'd try it out on the bottle opener hardware. The first thing you want to do when powder coating is strip the metal. Since this hardware has its own coloring of some kind, I'm assuming it needs to be stripped, so that's what I'm doing with the wire reel and the lathe. The second thing you want to do is clean the metal with rubbing alcohol or something along those lines. I forgot to do this, so you won't see that step, and I think it resulted in a slightly less attractive finish, but it's still pretty good. This is my setup for powder coating. I went cheap and made a little foil lined box thing that I use in conjunction with a heat gun instead of using an oven or a toaster oven. It works great, but someone has since pointed out that I could have just got a toaster oven on the cheap at a thrift store. Oh well. To do the actual powder coating, I preheat the metal before applying the powder. I do this because it helps the powder coat the metal more thoroughly. I think a better coating spray gun would also do the trick, but I went as cheap as I could because I didn't originally know if powder coating would even suit my needs. Now that it does, I have a setup that works, so I just don't want to spend any more money to change it. As I said before, I originally started powder coating for my hook and ring toss games, and one of the things I was looking for was impact resistance. Using this method, I can take 2 coated steel rings and smack them together pretty hard, and all that can be seen is a little dimple but no discoloration. The last step in the powder coating is to just bake it at 400 degrees for 10 minutes or so. I'm not sure what the heat gun output is or when exactly the part hits 400 degrees, but this setup seems to cure the powder just fine. I think the powder coating turned out pretty nice, but it's worth noting that it's still going to be scratched where it contacts the pointy parts of the bottle cap. However, this happens with the coloring that comes with the opener hardware as well. We're almost done now. Prior to applying the finish, I try to clean off as much of the sawdust as I can with some alcohol on a paper towel. Once it's clean and the alcohol is dried, I can begin to apply the finish. This time I decided to go with a wipe-on polyurethane. This wood is pretty thirsty, so I ended up doing a few coats, but I only showed the first one here because the process is the same. You just wipe it on. The only thing to note is that prior to applying the final coat, I waited a day and very gently sanded it with 1000 grit sandpaper. If you notice me put that rubber band on my wrist, I do that to remind myself to close the container. I've accidentally left it open a couple times, and I worry that doing so will allow the thinner in the polyurethane to evaporate and decrease its ability to cure properly. I wipe the poly on without spinning the opener on the drill so that I can apply it in the same direction as the grain. If you don't do this and there are streaks from the cloth, they'll be less noticeable if they're in the direction of the grain rather than perpendicular to it, just like sanding on the lathe versus off the lathe and sanding with the grain direction. Once the finish is cured, all that's left to do is put the 2 pieces together and start drinking. Hopefully you found this video helpful or interesting. Please feel free to leave your thoughts or constructive criticism in the comments. Thanks.